Yeah, it's an interesting story. The compensation actually, Britain's government took out a loan of £20 million in 1834 to pay off the slave owners, because that was the only way to get abolition through. But that was such an enormous amount of money that it wasn't paid off until 2015. They too have this history, and the king has indicated that he's looking at it by saying he wants to deepen his understanding of the legacies of slavery. But what he will do, it's not clear. But if there were to be a change of government in Britain, the current government, the Conservative government, is not interested in apology or reparations for slavery. They say that we shouldn't run from our history. But a future government could do something different, and that might open up the space for the king to apologise, because the constitutional monarch can only follow the government policy of the day. So as that quote shows, you know, the need is so great that the way that I look at it is that all our family charity can do really is set an example. The amounts of money are so small that they're a drop in the ocean, and they can never make up for the harm that was done, for the lives that were lost, the opportunities that didn't happen. But I hope that if more families engage in work like this, that prods governments to get to the table with the Caribbean and to begin discussing this.
And he said, I see this as work of repair. If he personally sold everything he owned, he still couldn't even begin to compensate for the lives his ancestors destroyed. So Laura Trevelyan is a former journalist with the BBC. In a historic move, BBC journalist Laura Trevelyan and her family recently made a public apology for their ancestral ownership of more than 1,000 slaves on the Caribbean island of Grenada. Trevelyan, now a full-time advocate for reparative justice, provided a £100,000 donation. Laura is descended from the Trevelyan family, who in 1835 shared £29,000 among themselves as compensation for owning 1,004 enslaved people on the island of Grenada. Laura is among the founders of Heirs of Enslavement, a charity working toward encouraging descendants of slave owners to directly participate in repairing the economies their ancestors helped to destroy. She also hosted with British MP Clive Lewis the podcast Heirs of Enslavement, which spoke about their connection on opposing sides of the slave trade and how it has affected their lives. So good morning, Laura. It's great to have you with us.
Good morning. Thanks so much for the invite.
No problem. So the first question I wanted to ask is, can you please tell us how you learned about your family's history as slave owners in Grenada?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, it speaks to the power of data, in fact, because certainly my generation and the generation above, my dad's generation, had no idea that our ancestors had been involved in the slave trade in Grenada. But in around about 2016, University College London in Britain published a database which they put online of all of the compensation that was paid when slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1834, not to the enslaved, as you might think, but actually to the slave owners. So compensating the slave owners was really the only way to get abolition of slavery through Parliament. And so when that database went online, various family members just casually put the name Trevelyan into the database, and then were shocked to see that it came up with compensation records relating to the enslaved in Grenada.
Oh, wow. So what did you feel at the time when you learned about this history?
I mean, I was really surprised and I was shocked. I knew that our ancestors were very involved with colonialism, with empire, had worked in India, in Ireland, but not the slave trade. That bit of it I didn't know about. But, you know, it was a very busy time. It was 2016. I was covering the US election here, which you'll remember, just like this year. It was a big one. And so I just sat with the information for a bit. But everybody in the family said, Laura, you're the reporter. You've written books. You know, what are you going to do with this information? What we need to know more. And that was definitely my feeling, but I couldn't figure out really a way into it. But then in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter protests here in New York City, here in Brooklyn, with protests every night, and presenting the BBC's World News America show, where every night we were doing interviews about what did this mean, why was it happening. I just began to think that if one of the legacies of slavery in America was police brutality towards Black men, then what was the legacy of slavery on that small Caribbean island of Grenada, where my ancestors had been absentee slave owners? So the BBC let me go to make a documentary, and I met members of Grenada's National Reparations Committee, so many people on the island, all of whom explained to me that slavery is not in the past as far as they're concerned, that there are living legacies today.
So, I wanted to ask, were there stories in your family? It sounds like there were not any stories in your family about the ancestors, those ancestors that were in the Caribbean. Like this just was not something that was talked about.
No, nobody in my generation or the generation above had any idea that our common relatives, John Trevelyan, that in 1757 he actually married the daughter of a prominent slave trader in Britain. And that's how the slavery connection came into the family, via that marriage. So no, nobody knew anything about that, or about the fact that the Trevelyans had owned at different times 10 different sugarcane plantations in Grenada, enslaving what must have been thousands of Africans. I mean, at abolition, the records show that various relatives claimed compensation for just over 1,000 enslaved Africans. And one of the things about it that is really extraordinary is that under British law, the enslaved were seen as property. And so that was why their enslavers were permitted to claim compensation when slavery was abolished. It was for the loss of what was termed their property, which seems extraordinary and brutal to us now. But it just shows you that the mindset that went along with slavery.
Right, right. And if you could tell us about your friendship with MP Lewis, and your shared historical connection through the institution of slavery. And if you want to explain like who he is, you would be better equipped to do that than I would, because we have a very
Yes,
different system here.
absolutely. So Clive Lewis is a member of Parliament in Britain. He is a member for a constituency in Norwich, which is in the east of England, and he's of British and Grenadian descent. His father is from Grenada. So when our family went to Grenada last February and we apologized for the role of our ancestors in enslaving the ancestors of the people of Grenada, Clive actually stood up in Parliament in the House of Commons in Britain on that day and said, if a family can apologize and pay reparations for slavery, then why can't Britain's government? And so the connection was made like that. And so afterwards I reached out to Clive and we just began to talk about this legacy. And we figured out, you know, because Grenada is such a small island and Clive's father lives quite close, even to this day, to a plantation called the Beausejour plantation that was once part owned by the Trevelyans. So even though Clive's father was part of what's called the Windrush generation, people who went to Britain in the post-war period to help rebuild Britain's economy, because there were so few opportunities in the West Indies and there was that colonial link. But Clive's father has recently returned. So we decided that we wanted to make a podcast about this shared history, because it's really a microcosm of Britain. The fact that Clive's ancestors might have been owned by mine. So we went to explore. We went to Grenada, we asked people what this history means. We talked about the Caribbean has what's called a 10-point reparations plan for slavery, asking Britain and the other former colonial powers to first of all apologize for what happened and then to pay reparations directly to, it's not sort of money going to people individually. It would be money going towards health and education and debt forgiveness in the Caribbean, because these are the areas which really have suffered.
Right, right. And then, so some of the topics that you kind of like just describe what some of the topics are that you guys covered in the podcast. How was the reception for the podcast, both in Britain and beyond?
Well, it was good. We had, gosh, the last time I looked, I think we had 35,000 downloads, which for a subject like this, which is quite tough, is pretty good. The podcast was nominated for a Radio Academy Award for what's called an ARIA in Britain for Best New Series. And we did lots and lots of interviews about it in Britain. I guess people were just intrigued by the idea that Clive and I could be linked by this history, even almost 200 years later, and that we would want to explore it. And I think for Clive, it was a way of showing the contribution of what's called the Windrush generation in Britain, people like his father who grew up in the West Indies and then came to Britain in the post-war period because that's where the jobs were, but then faced discrimination and hardship, but made it nonetheless, and now, you know, have gone back to the West Indies in triumph, really. But at the same time, that story and the link of the Windrush generation to slavery is underappreciated, really, in Britain. The fact that people came, they came because the West Indies were colonies of Britain, because they had been enslaved, and there were no opportunities in the West Indies, and that's why people came to Britain. So it was really for us a chance to tell that story and to look at the Caribbean's reparatory justice demands today and to ask whether they have any chance of success.
Right. And when you say they didn't have any opportunities, so is there still like a lack of jobs there, a lack of infrastructure and that kind of thing, like that the people who actually live there are not able to find employment?
Well, I mean, somewhere like Grenada has, for example, a thriving tourism industry. It has the St. George's Medical School and Vet School. There's a lot of trade, but unemployment is still high. It's more the sort of direct legacies of slavery that you see in Grenada today are underinvestment, because in the period of slavery, all the money left the Caribbean. It all went into the hands of those that were in the sugarcane trade. And obviously the enslaved weren't paid anything. And even after emancipation, they were paid very, very little. So poverty and illiteracy were legacies of slavery, underinvestment in education, underinvestment in healthcare. And what people in Grenada told me when I went for the documentary was that, you know, if you look at Grenada's national dish, it's called oil down. It's a one-pot dish that was made by the slaves from whatever they could find, which things like salted fish and coconut milk and breadfruit. And it's a very unhealthy dish. It's very high in processed, you know, it's high in salt, it's high in sugar. And that, people in Grenada told me, that legacy of poor diet has led to, at least in part, the epidemic of obesity, hypertension, and diabetes that you see not just in Grenada, but across the Caribbean. So that's a legacy as well as the economic underdevelopment.
Right, right. And so what are some of the lasting effects of the slave trade that can still be seen in Grenada and the Caribbean that you might have seen and witnessed yourself?
So I guess that's what we were just talking about. So, for example, a legacy of poor health, a legacy of a diet which is very high in salt and very high in sugar. So, of course, that's something that people are trying to come to terms with today. You have the fact that, you know, there's really chronic underinvestment in education and in healthcare. Yes, there's a lot of tourism in Grenada, but most of the industries are foreign owned. So for the government to really invest in health and education, it's difficult from a relatively low tax base to do that. So, you know, these former British colonies in the Caribbean are successful countries. You know, they've overcome much, but they are working with one hand tied behind their back, really. And now they have the very real issue of climate change, of more intense storms and rising sea levels, which in itself is an indirect legacy of slavery. Nobody asked to be in the Caribbean. Their ancestors were kidnapped from Africa and they were dumped there. And now they're dealing with the consequences of industrialization, which has benefited not really them, but the former enslavers. So it's a complicated situation, and there's definitely a strong case for climate resiliency funding, you know, for Britain and the other former colonial powers to help the Caribbean, who are now suffering from this crisis of rising sea levels.
Right. And you had mentioned that after emancipation that they were not paid well. Did the sugarcane plantations continue and just pay them less, like as like sharecroppers, I guess, like they did in the South here?
That's exactly what happened. So when slavery was abolished, the formerly enslaved were technically free, but they were then meant to be apprenticed for a further 4 years and unpaid during that period of apprenticeship. So it wasn't until 1838 that anybody received any money. And then, yes, the wages were extremely low. I mean, formerly enslaved were not in a position to bargain. They had nowhere to go. They were a workforce. So the poverty, the illiteracy continues for years. And it's not really until the late 19th century even that schooling becomes more prevalent in the West Indies. And if you look at, say, the case of Jamaica, even as late as the 1860s, there's a revolt in Jamaica and by the formerly enslaved against the terrible conditions that they're in, and it's brutally put down. And the British actually recall Governor Eyre, who's in charge of Jamaica, because he summarily executes people who dare to rebel against these poor conditions. So slavery ended, but the conditions of slavery didn't, and persisted for an extremely long time, as you say, much like sharecropping here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And when you looked at the compensation, where did the funds for the actual compensation come from? And I mean, if they came from like the economy there, how did that affect conditions in the Caribbean to have even more money taken out of the Caribbean, or did it come from the Crown? I'm not really sure how that worked.
Actually, yeah, it's an interesting story. The compensation actually, Britain's government took out a loan of £20 million in 1834 to pay off the slave owners, because that was the only way to get abolition through. But that was such an enormous amount of money that it wasn't paid off until 2015. So when people say that Britain's government shouldn't pay reparations and it's not fair and all the rest of it, you know, it wasn't really very fair that the people of Britain took out this enormous loan and it took them all that time to pay it off. So yes, it was a loan.
And presumably it was a loan from banks with interest, which is why it took so long to pay it off?
Yes, I don't know the details of it, but yes, that would be right. I mean, it was an enormous amount of money. £20 million in 1834 was money.
Right. And then you had formed actually two charities that I saw, the Heirs of Enslavement, and I don't remember the name of the other one, which was with your family. What is the goal of the charities you've helped form, and what is your ultimate hope for the people of Grenada?
Well, one is not really a charity. One is just it's a group called Heirs of Slavery, and it's with 7 other people that have this background of being descended from enslavers in the British Caribbean. And the idea of that really was just to encourage other people with this background to come forward, to connect them to islands and people in the Caribbean who want to talk about this legacy, to encourage people to look at what they might be able to do to repair the harm that was done by their ancestors. So that's the Heirs of Slavery group. But then with my family members, we formed an actual charity in the UK called the Trevelyan Grenada Reparations Fund. And the purpose of that is to give money towards education in Grenada, because when I was in Grenada and I asked people, you know, what is there something that we can do? Do we have a moral responsibility? Everyone said yes. You know, illiteracy was a legacy of slavery at abolition, and our education system is still underfunded. You know, our young people need opportunities. So yes, we're fundraising from family members at the moment, and in July we'll be giving some money to a charity in rural Grenada which helps children with the cost of going to school, backpacks, bus fares, and that kind of thing.
Oh, cool. Awesome. So I guess so the reparations that you provided, as well as your family, they've actually been being used to help with the education system there?
Yes, that's right. I gave £100,000 myself last year, and that money has gone to the University of the West Indies, and Grenada's National Reparations Committee is deciding in conjunction with the University of the West Indies exactly what the money will be spent on. One idea is for scholarships, but That's something that Grenada's National Reparations Committee is talking about in conjunction with the University of the West Indies. But then separately, our family charity is giving money to rural school children. But you asked what the ultimate aim is. Well, my hope would be that a future British government, and there is a general election in Britain this year, a future British government might think about apologising for the historic links of Britain to the slave trade, because the whole system was sanctioned by Britain's government, taxed by Britain's government, legalised by Britain's government. You know, it wasn't just people randomly going out to the Caribbean. They had the full backing of the state, as we see by the fact that the state then paid them off at abolition. So I think acknowledgement of that is important for the Caribbean and for descendants of the enslaved in Britain. And then I also hope that Britain's government would sit down with the Caribbean governments and talk about the reparations plan.
Oh, awesome. And I heard that I had read in one of the articles that you provided that King Charles made some sort of a statement. I don't remember if it was like an actual apology or if it was something, but it was some kind of, he did say something to the people of the Caribbean.
Well, the king has said that he is seeking to deepen his understanding of the lasting impact of slavery. And he's also said that this is a conversation whose time has come, without saying what he would do about it. And the royal family is also linked to slavery, because the Royal African Company in the 17th century was set up by an ancestor of King Charles, in fact, and was responsible for shipping the enslaved from Africa to the Caribbean and to British America. So the royal family did profit from the slave trade at its inception. It sanctioned it. They too have this history, and the king has indicated that he's looking at it by saying he wants to deepen his understanding of the legacies of slavery. But what he will do, it's not clear. But if there were to be a change of government in Britain, the current government, the Conservative government, is not interested in apology or reparations for slavery. They say that we shouldn't run from our history, but a future government could do something different, and that might open up the space for the king to apologise, because the constitutional monarch can only follow the government policy of the day.
Right, right. And so I wanted to quote the CS Monitor article, which was about the cousin of King Charles who joined your group, the Heirs of Enslavement, on its founding, and get your thoughts. So David Lascelles says he asks himself, what can we do that is actually useful and wanted, not to solve our own conscience? And to answer his own question, he and his wife have dedicated 2 decades to working with communities around Harewood House, where there's a large West Indian population, including investments in the arts and education. And he said, when we started, there was no one else doing this. It was a big leap in the dark, but we decided, let's be hated for what we do rather than for doing nothing.
Yes, well, David Lascelles, as that quote shows, that he and his wife have been working at their property, Harewood House, for some years, which a property that was built with the proceeds of slavery in Barbados. So he acknowledged that legacy a long time ago and has worked to try to address it. And just recently, for example, he had an exhibition called Missing Portraits, because all the portraits at Harewood House are of the grandees, the aristocrats from the 18th and 19th century. There are no portraits of the enslaved whose labor helped to build the house. So David tried to rectify that with portraits of Black Britons, and including the actor David Harewood, actually, who is from Barbados and shares the same name, presumably because his ancestors would have been enslaved by David Lascelles' ancestors. So, yeah, I think the key is to be, I've found, is to be, you know, guided by the Caribbean in this, to do what people think is useful. And Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, where I'm a fellow, an honorary fellow in the PJ Patterson Institute there for Africa Caribbean Advocacy. Sir Hilary said, it is important for your family to apologise, because in the Caribbean, our history is a void. We don't know where we came from. We don't know where our ancestors came from. We just know that they were kidnapped. And you're actually part of our history. So if you come forward and apologise, it will be meaningful. It will help to fill that painful void. So just to the point of, asking what is useful, what is wanted, that's certainly what I've tried to do. And investment in education is something that people say is important, but obviously what one family can do is only very limited, which is why I do think the CARICOM 10-point plan for reparatory justice, which the Caribbean governments drew up more than 10 years ago, that calls on the former colonial powers to invest in healthcare and education, in debt relief, and those larger amounts of money are what could really make a difference.
Right. Because I know I had read many years ago, it was actually written right after the Rwanda genocides, it was called The Blue Sweater. And she talked about how money was coming in from foreign governments to teach the people how to make baskets that no one wanted to buy. So it was kind of like it was like there was all this money coming in, but it wasn't being used for what they needed. So in that instance where they didn't ask what they needed, and that might have helped in that situation. So it's really great that that what you guys are doing is trying to do what they actually need, what will actually help their people to progress in, and being able to have, better their lives and stuff like that. And then the founder of North Street Educational Development Fund, Donald Reynolds in Kingston, Jamaica, had said of the donations being generated by non-governmental organizations such as yours, he said, we need more schools and more children in them. We need more hospitals, electricity in rural areas. That's what they need. Help developing their country, not money lining government pockets or apologies or chit chats. And it seems like these are the kinds of institutions and assistance that your charity and your work is also focusing on.
Yes, except as that quote shows, the need is so great that the way that I look at it is that all our family charity can do really is set an example. The amounts of money are so small that they're a drop in the ocean, and they can never make up for the harm that was done, for the lives that were lost, the opportunities that didn't happen. But I hope that if more families engage in work like this, that prods governments to get to the table with the Caribbean and to begin discussing this.
Right. And I was watching another video with British commentators who were complaining that small donations and apologies aren't enough since the enrichment from slavery was so much greater. And I wanted to quote a statement by Mr. Renton, with whom you founded Heirs of Enslavement, sorry. And he said, I see this as work of repair. If he personally sold everything he owned, he still couldn't even begin to compensate for the lives his ancestors destroyed. And I thought that was like a really powerful statement that he said, because it's true. Like, even if you gave everything you had, it's still not enough. And that's why it seems like you're trying to get more people to get involved in that way. Would you say that that seems kind of like?
Yes, definitely. I mean, right, there's just no way that any amount of money could make up for what happened. And the money and the apology, these are things that the Caribbean want in the hope that they will set an example to governments. The CARICOM 10-point plan from 2014 was aimed at the former colonial powers of France, Britain, Portugal, Spain. It wasn't aimed at families or institutions, but what you've seen in Britain now is a real reckoning, both from individuals whose ancestors profited from slavery and the Church of England too, which is also giving £100 million of its endowment fund to set up a fund to address legacies of slavery in the Caribbean and in Britain. So the wheels are beginning to turn, and where it goes, I don't know.
Right. So I guess the ultimate goal is to get the governments to participate, but especially with like the types of governments that are in the UK, similar to America, it can take a really long time. And there's party shifts and party changes, and one party might be amenable to something, and then the next party that comes in is not, does not want to participate. So it kind of becomes like a really long-term kind of goal. So it seems really cool that that the charities that you're working with are doing kind of like small steps, like what they can do. Like it's good to start somewhere.
Yeah, definitely small steps. And it is a very different situation to here in the US. I mean, you think New York State has just set up its commission for reparations on slavery. And the difference is that, here in the US, the enslavers and the enslaved lived cheek by jowl. But in Britain, the enslavers, by and large, just farmed it all out to overseers in the Caribbean. And there was really no direct link. And people didn't really know. They could turn a blind eye to the horrors of what were happening on their plantations, to the brutality. And it was only when people actually came to Britain, the Windrush generation came to Britain after World War II, that there were a significant number of people of Caribbean descent in Britain. So it is a very different situation, which has enabled Britain not to think really about the legacies of slavery because it happened out of sight.
Right, exactly. And so are there any other charities that you work with in the UK, US, or Caribbean that are making a difference in this situation?
Well, I think the Coming to the Table group in America, for example, that's a quote from Martin Luther King, that he had a vision that descendants of the enslaved and descendants of enslavers would come to the table and discuss this legacy. I know that they're doing interesting work trying to reconcile individual histories. And there's actually a very good documentary that just came out called The Cost of Inheritance about exactly that, where descendants of enslavers meet with descendants of the enslaved and look at their very different economic positions all these years after slavery and try and discuss, well, what can be done. And it is a very difficult topic, as you know. So I think that's really a very good example of something that's happening.
Awesome. And is there anything else that you would like to add that we haven't covered, or that maybe you wanted to provide more details about?
I guess the only thing I would say is that what's become clear to me over the last couple of years is that it's the acknowledgement of what happened, of the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, that it's important for descendants of enslavers to acknowledge that, and that does seem to be meaningful and to be part of the healing process. Certainly in the Caribbean, I found that people have said this is important. Yes, what does apology do for me? How does it change my life? But actually, one woman said to me, I feel like a weight that I didn't even know I was carrying has been lifted by your apology in Grenada. So I hope that this is just the beginning.
Oh, that's awesome. So that was all the questions that I had, and it was really, really nice to meet with you. I'm so excited that we got to connect, and I'm really excited for the work that you're doing in the Caribbean and everything else that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. Just one thing, it's very confusing. The podcast is called Heirs of Enslavement, and the group in Britain is called Heirs of Slavery. It's very
perfect.
A lot of
I will definitely.
I get confused myself. But thank you so much for the interest, and take care.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye.